I would like to welcome you all to this seminar on European issues. The title of today's seminar is The Rise of Euroscepticism and How to Deal with It in the EU. And this, before we start, I would just like to say that this seminar is part of a series of seminars that we have here at NUPI on different issues related to Europe and the EU. And it is funded, this series is funded by the Norwegian MFA, and it's also closely linked to a research project that we just initiated, entitled Europe in Transition, Small States and Europe in an Age of Global Shifts, which is, by the way, funded by the Norwegian Research Council. Last week, we had Stephen Blockmans here talking about the EU's role in peacemaking, and next week, we will have Malgorzata Wasilewska from the European External Action Service, who will give us an insider view of the same topic. But today we are very pleased to have Mark Leonard here to talk about Euroscepticism. This is a very important topic, given the fact that Eurosceptic parties for both the left and the right have got increased support throughout Europe. In the election to the European Parliament in May this year, for instance, populist parties got more than 25% of the votes in many countries. And it is also important to add that many of the mainstream parties in Europe have also changed their position on Europe and have become more skeptical. The rise of Euroscepticism represents a challenge for Europe in the sense that it questions the very legitimacy of the European project as such, and it challenges the effectiveness of the EU or its ability to make decisions. It might even threaten the structure of the EU with the free mobility of persons and potentially also lead to an exit of Britain. Today, we are very pleased to have Mark Leonard here to speak about these issues. Mark is the co-founder and director of an important think tank in London called European Council of Foreign Relations. He is also an expert on European politics and EU's role in the world. Mark is also the person behind, if I'm not mistaken, the concept Cool Britannia that was launched or relaunched in the 1990s with the New Labour. And also the author of the best-selling book, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century from 2005. And it will be interesting to hear your views on that today, now with Europe being more in decline and also Britain risking exit in the European Union. So with no further ado, I would give the floor to you. You will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and then we will have a 10-minute comments by the director of NUPI, Sverdrup. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and also for inviting me here to NUPI, which is one of the great European think tanks, and very happy to have had the chance to welcome you to London before, and to have talked about the Norwegian model within in London. So it feels kind of appropriate to be discussing Euroscepticism here in Oslo. I, if you don't mind, would like to start the remarks with a joke that's doing the rounds in London at the moment. It's a joke about the end of the world, so I'm sorry to bring the tone of the proceedings down so quickly, but the story is that God summons the leaders of the United States, China, and Britain and tells them that the world is going to end tomorrow and that they should go back to their countries and prepare their people for this event. So Barack Obama is the first off the mark. He decides to call a televised press conference in the Oval Office. My fellow Americans, he says, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we were right about the existence of God, but unfortunately the world's going to end tomorrow. Then Xi Jinping calls a press conference on CCTV, and he says, I have bad news and worse news. The bad news is that we were wrong about the existence of God, and unfortunately the world's going to end tomorrow. And then David Cameron calls his press conference on the BBC and comes out of Downing Street with a big smile on his face, and he says, I got great news! God thinks I'm one of the 3 most important people in the world. I think the reason it's funny is because it's quite close to the bone. The more dangerous the world becomes, the more divided, the more parochial, self-referential, and trivial our politics becomes. And I think there's an overriding sense in most countries that they can no longer actually get any traction on what's going on in the world. They feel that it's out of control. And that's one of the things which is driving a reversion to identity politics, a focus on who we are, what makes us special, as a surrogate for an idea of political agency. And I think that, in a way, is the kind of biggest single driver of Euroscepticism. Got a couple of, I think everyone knows that Euroscepticism is on the rise. Used to be described as a British disease, but unfortunately it's spread like a virus across the continent, infecting pretty much everyone else. I got a couple of slides which show, I think, what we all know, but if you look at these figures, you can see quite clearly that trust in the EU's had its ups and downs, but there was a kind of moment when the Euro crisis hit where the numbers of people distrusting the EU just went right up, and the levels of trust fell down to sort of record levels. And it's almost the kind of reverse of the sort of optimistic times when the euro was created and other things. The other thing which is quite interesting is the extent to which it is a universal phenomenon. So if you look at these figures, in blue you have the trust levels for all the member states in 2007 before the euro crisis hit, and then in red you've got the figures for 2013. And what's kind of interesting about it is that if you look at the blue figures, there's just one country that is below the mark, a country with which I'm quite familiar. So Euroscepticism, as I said, was kind of seen as a British thing, and everybody else was quite up about Europe. So you've got these kind of very high levels. You know, look at some countries like Spain, for example, very high levels of support for the EU. Portugal. You know, some of your neighbours were quite enthusiastic about the EU as well. But if you look at the figures now for 2013, Britain's actually relatively normal, you know. It's much less sceptical than the Spanish, the Greeks, the Cypriots. And there are only a few countries that are still positive, and they're ones that have yet to be fully socialised by the EU into Euroscepticism. So I think what's striking about those figures is that you see there's skepticism not just in the countries that have suffered the most, the debtor countries, but also amongst creditors, amongst countries in the euro, outside of the euro, opt-outs, pre-ins. Pretty much everybody, apart from Bulgaria, I think, is more skeptical now than, in fact, even Bulgaria is more skeptical than it was before. So why is this happening? Well, there are loads of things that have been written about it and lots of debate and discussion. So I'm going to try and come at it through sort of three different prisms. I think there are three stories that could be helpful in terms of us trying to understand what is going on with Euroscepticism. And then also, the organisers very unfairly asked me to say what one can do about it. So I have less to say about that, but I'll maybe say about what we shouldn't do about it and put forward some ideas about what one might do about it. But I'll leave plenty of that material for the discussion afterwards, because if not, I'll be here all day if I try and do justice to that question. So so the three ways into it, I'd like to talk about the level of narrative, the story about what Europe's for, the level of the nature of the EU project, and thirdly, about the idea of political organisation, what's happening to politics, to representative democratic politics more generally, because I think that a lot of what's happening is a symptom of actually more seismic changes to the whole idea of political representation. So if we start with narrative, I think that's a very interesting and striking area. I spent a lot of time for my sins over the last few years hanging out with key figures inside the new Eurosceptic movement in Britain, trying to understand their arguments, the way that they've shifted the political debate, the way that they think about the future of Europe. And it's not the first time in my life that I've spent more time with Eurosceptics in Britain than was entirely comfortable or healthy. I worked in the British Parliament in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty was going through and when Euroscepticism emerged as a serious political force. And John Major even famously called a third of his cabinet the bastards because they were trying to block the Maastricht Treaty. But what I found is that they're very different today from the way that they were before. And whilst pro-Europeans like to accuse the Eurosceptics of wanting to take Britain back to the 1950s, maybe even the 1850s, the uncomfortable truth is that the Eurosceptics have done more to modernize their arguments, to change the way they're thinking, to broaden their coalition than the pro-Europeans have. And the way that I think you could see the crisis happening in the UK is, I mean, the closest parallel that I can find is with what happened after 9/11 in America, where the neocons were able to use a real-world crisis, which was the attack on the World Trade Center, to change the political debate and to allow things to happen which were only tangentially related to it, like the invasion of Iraq. And I think if you look at what's happening in the British debate in particular, we can see the Euro crisis playing a similar role to 9/11. But the calls for Britain to leave and the way that the debate has been changed is very similar to what happened after 9/11 in the US. And whilst that was sort of happening, I think the pro-European coalition has shrunk and has failed to reinvent itself and to think about what's going on in the new world. And that's led to a profound sense of confusion amongst pro-Europeans, because what they don't understand is that they're not being attacked. In the 90s, people granted their achievements and attacked them for things which they didn't do. So they said, okay, you might have been getting your way on enlargement, on liberalizing the single market, on creating economic growth, but you're destroying our sovereignty, and that's why we can't move forward with you. What's happening now is that the Eurosceptics are using all of the things that the pro-European elite think are their proudest achievements, the things that they're the most proud about, to attack them. And that is quite a confusing set of events. So the biggest arguments against Europe today are the creation of the single market, fostering a European trade agenda, championing enlargement to the East. And that, I think that's the sort of genius of the Eurosceptics. If you really want to understand where public opinion is, I think the best way is to sort of understand what kind of an issue Europe is. So it's an issue where public attitudes are motivated as much by identity and values as by the traditional metrics of class or financial interest. So the best way, I think, to sort of engage with public opinion on that is to look at the sort of literature on those sorts of issues. And everybody who talks about values starts with Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And I think the way to understand how public opinion is kind of shifting on this is to start with that. And if you kind of start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you probably split an advanced industrial society like Britain into three main tribes. First, you have the settlers, who are basically they're sort of naturally conservative, focused on safety, security, and belonging. And the pollsters estimate they're about 30% of the British population. The second group, kind of one up on the hierarchy of needs, would be seen as the prospectors, people who want to maximize their wealth. They want personal advancement. They want the opportunity to enrich themselves, to increase their status. That's about 30% of the population as well. And then the next tier up on the hierarchy of needs is the pioneers, which kind of weirdly in Britain are now, because we're such a post-material place, they make up 40% of the population. And they're people whose material needs are basically satisfied. So what they're interested in is actualizing themselves. So it's kind of post-material concerns. They care a lot about the big picture, the future. They're more kind of in search of exciting experiences than satisfying basic needs. And I got a very good friend, Adam Lurie, who's a brilliant, he set up the most interesting advertising company, I think, ever, certainly in Britain. He's not doing ads anymore, but I talked to him a lot about these issues. And he said his argument is that the genius of the pro-European case in the past was that it had a story to tell to each of those three groups. So the peace and security narrative appealed to the settlers, the single market and the promise of economic advancement appealed to the prospectors. And the idea of Europe as a kind of model for the world, an experiment in the future, was something which was naturally attractive to the pioneers. And the crisis that I think we have today is that all of those three narratives are dead, and the Eurosceptics have actually been much better at appealing to all three tribes than the pro-Europeans have. So if you look at Britain, and Britain is not that different from other countries for reasons we can discuss later, UKIP and Nigel Farage have got this very powerful appeal to the settlers. They say that rather than offering peace and security, what the EU's done is it's deprived us of control of our borders. It's flooded our communities with migrants who drive down wages, inflate housing prices, put pressure on local schools and hospitals. And UKIP has become very good at talking for the settled majority in the country, but it adopts the rhetoric and the tactics of an oppressed minority by talking about self-government and independence and these sorts of issues. The next group, the prospectors, they're the ones that many of the Tory Eurosceptics have been appealing to. And what they're saying is that it's wrong to see the EU as being economically good for us. What you need to do is understand that Britain is, this is the phrase of Douglas Carswell, who recently defected from the Conservative Party to UKIP. He said that we're tethered to the corpse of the Eurozone. So the idea is that the Eurozone is kind of economic suicide for the continent, that the single market, instead of creating opportunities for us, is actually tying our business in red tape. The customs union doesn't actually expand our access to markets. It means that we can't sign free trade deals with large parts of the world because we're hampered by every crazy protectionist lobby in France. And those sorts of arguments have been repeated so endlessly that they've actually started to feed through to public opinion. There was an opinion poll last year by YouGov which found that 32% of people thought that leaving the European Union would be good for British jobs, with only 31 believing that it would be bad for British jobs. And the last third thinking it wouldn't make any difference at all. So that's the sort of second group. And then the third and most surprising thing is the way that Eurosceptics have started to appeal to pioneers. Again, Douglas Carswell, I think the most intelligent and sophisticated of the Eurosceptics, has this story about the EU, and he says it's not modern, it's not exotic, it's a project that's failed, it's provincial, old-fashioned, a fossilized relic of the 20th century in a new digital world. And what he kind of says is that what matters nowadays to Britain in the future is not post-colonial reach or the ability to fight alongside America in military interventions, but the real freedom to trade globally. So people like him, they say, what's wrong with being the Singapore of Europe that can have those sorts of global relationships? And they have this very appealing, obviously completely bogus account of the world as this sort of place where geography doesn't really matter very much. People can kind of live together economically and politically in the cloud. And the countries that they admire the most are not the sort of old-fashioned blimpish countries. It's places like Dubai, Singapore, Australia, that have successfully managed to carve out a global role without being kind of hung up about trying to shape the world. So they say Tony Blair is very old-fashioned with his kind of need to want to reorder the world. That's not the kind of world we live in. We're the really modern, exciting people. So if you take those three things together, the kind of UKIP case, the economic conservatists idea about being tethered to the euro and this sort of technological utopianism, it's got a different feel to it than the blimpish isolationism of the Eurosceptics when I was working in the House of Commons. And you can see why those things can both be appealing and help to create a wider coalition, but also how deep the crisis of pro-Europeanism is. It's not simply a cyclical economic crisis. There is a sort of crisis of meaning. It's very difficult for Europeans, pro-Europeans, to actually tell a story which connects with these different groups. So as a result, they're often left defending a status quo that visibly doesn't work, rather than actually trying to sort of engage and come up with a forward-leaning narrative for the future. So anyway, so that's one way into the crisis. Another way into it is to think about what's happened to the European Union itself, because I think one of the reasons why the new narratives are hitting home is that the EU itself is not the EU that was captured by these attractive narratives. So, you know, there's all the kind of bad stuff that's happened between 2007 and 2013 in terms of the economy. But there's also a sort of profound political change which has taken place within the EU. Because, you know, in the old days, people used to talk about the democratic deficit as one of the drivers for Euroscepticism. And it was always complete sort of nonsense. Everyone knows that there's a democratic surplus rather than a democratic deficit within the EU. If you look at how complex the structures are, it's much more difficult to get anything through the EU than through any other federal, confederal system in the world in terms of the majorities that you need to pass things, the amount of process that's involved, the checks and balances. You know, there were other deficits, maybe a political deficit and different things like that, but it wasn't a real democratic deficit. That was a kind of nonsense argument. Particularly because the stuff the EU did was by and large quite boring and not the kind of stuff anyone wanted to be involved anyway. That's why there was this democratic surplus. People were being forced to vote about things they couldn't care less about. And that was the sort of crisis with all these referenda where you get them to vote about treaties which are totally meaningless and the sort of stuff which, frankly, diplomats should be allowed to get on with because they're quite difficult for ordinary people to understand. It was just annoying even to have to kind of talk and read about these things. Everyone who read the Maastricht Treaty ended up being very anti the Maastricht Treaty because it was just such a painful drag to try and make your way through the different articles and to make sense of what they meant. And there was a sort of unwritten rule that the EU institutions would police the single market, technical areas of policy. They'd be very good at coming up with common standards for the composition of tomato paste, lawnmower sound emissions, and national governments would continue to have a monopoly on the delivery of services and policy making in the areas that people really cared about. And that's why people were much happier to get involved in national elections and local elections, because it's actually about stuff that mattered to them. But with the onset of the crisis, I think a lot of this changed in a very dramatic way in the debtor countries, because actually now the EU is not just dealing with the composition of tomato paste and other things. You have Commission officials sitting in every ministry in Greece, telling the officials what they can and can't do in every single area. If you read the memoranda of understanding, they go way beyond what is remotely justifiable by the kind of nature of the crisis, telling them what size their shops should be, what level the pensions should be at. I mean, they're really getting into things that people care about a lot. So many citizens in southern European countries, you know, feel a bit like South American countries did when the IMF came in and kind of bound them in a golden straitjacket that strangled the space for any national politics. And if you read the Greek press, you know, it's all about what they can't do because of Brussels. So there is a massive, gaping democratic deficit in Greece. It's really a different sort of thing from the theoretical democratic deficit of the 1990s. So I think that sort of explains why, you know, the Greeks are down here and the Spanish are down here and the Portuguese are down here from having been very enthusiastic beforehand. But what is also striking is that the northern European countries, the creditors, also not very enthusiastic about what's going on. Look at the Germans over here, for example. The Dutch, I don't know where they are. They're over the Austrians. Nobody's very happy about this because they think that actually the EU is doing a terrible job of controlling these wayward southern countries that are racking up all of this debt and expecting the kind of prosperous northern Europeans to bail them out. So they feel equally frustrated. So the problem that's emerging is not so much one between Brussels and the national capitals. It's more about this conflict between the democratic will of southern countries and of northern countries and of different countries in different places. And as a result, you have a pervasive sense of victimhood that runs right across the spectrum. And it's a sort of victimhood that's very difficult to dispel because in a national political system, not always that good at getting people not to feel like victims. We'll talk about that a bit more in my third kind of trend. But in theory, political parties can actually voice different perspectives, and then they can sort of act as a referee between them and to find common ground between them, and there is a way of sort of aggregating these things. But that's exactly what the European political system can't deliver, because instead of a battle of ideas, what we've seen emerge within the European space is a vicious battle between, a vicious circle between the sort of forward march of Europe, driven by the technical necessity of integration, which has made the EU into what appears to many people a sort of technocratic, elite-led project. And then the populist backlash which that engenders. And these two forces are mutually reinforcing, because obviously the more integration there is by this technocratic elite across different places, the stronger the backlash. And when that backlash expresses itself with people voting no in referenda for treaties, that forces the technocrats to become even more inventive and find better ways of taking things out of the political system, because they don't want to hit no's all the time. They don't want to be constrained because of the necessity of integration in order to survive. So that, in turn, engenders an even greater backlash. So you get this kind of negative spiral that's emerging. And as a result, you don't actually have any debate about where Europe should be going. So when the European elections happen, on the one hand, you have the establishment parties that are calling for more Europe for the status quo, defense of the status quo, and the insurgent parties that are calling for less Europe and to destroy the status quo. And that kind of gap is becoming I think one of the biggest threats, not just to the EU project in Brussels, but is leading to a reshaping of our political system at a national level. And that's kind of where I want to end up. I think that's the third way into it. It's kind of thinking about how politics is changing at a national level. And Pernilla, when she was introducing it, talked about the European elections this year, where you saw unprecedented numbers of populist and Eurosceptic representatives elected from Denmark and Hungary to Germany and Greece. And, you know, the most striking thing was that in countries like France and Britain, big kind of member states, the number one parties in the elections were not the established parties that everyone's come to kind of hate and despise over the last few years, but relatively new insurgent parties, the Front National in France, the UK Independence Party in the UK. And we saw also, you know, a whole load of voters flocking to a range of insurgent parties, from former communists to new movements of the kind of radical right in different places. So in Spain, you saw the launch of Podemos, which is a Latin American-inspired party which grew out of a fraction called the anti-capitalist left. And their mission is, quote, to stop Spain becoming a colony of Germany and the Troika. In Greece, the leftist Syriza party emerged as the biggest group. In Poland, there was a surge in support for the Law and Justice Party, as well as a creation of a new radical right grouping called the Congress of the New Right. And the question, I suppose, is why did that happen? And for me, the most convincing explanation for it comes from Peter Kellner, who's a British pollster, who said that the surge of these insurgent parties is the political consequence of the economic trends that Thomas Piketty described in his work on rising inequality. So although there are wide variations across Europe, I think it's pretty clear in those elections that there are two groups of voters that showed up in disproportionate numbers. Firstly, urban voters from former industrial heartlands who are at the sharp end of immigration. And secondly, rural voters who are put off by the liberal social values adopted by mainstream parties of the centre-left and centre-right. And these, I think, are the groups which have increasingly been abandoned by the mainstream parties, which are seen to be becoming increasingly cosmopolitan, metrosexual. And there's a kind of widespread sense in many countries that the parties of the left are now basically the representatives not of the traditional working classes, but of public sector workers and the cultural industries, while countries on the right are now basically there to defend the interests of finance and big business. And that leaves quite a large sway of voters who were not seen as driving politics in their countries. So they were taken for granted by these mainstream parties and largely abandoned. And it's those left behind voters that came out in such big numbers in the European elections. So I think in order to understand what's happening, it's worth sort of delving a bit more deeply into the crisis of the mainstream. And this is something which the late political scientist Peter Mayer wrote, I think, about very eloquently. He wrote an article, I think, almost sort of 10 years ago in the, called Ruling the Void, where he kind of used this metaphor of a void that had opened up where traditional politics used to be. And I think it's that sort of void that he's talking about that the insurgent forces are trying to fill. I think that metaphor of the void works in a number of different ways. Most banally, it's the void which has been left by the citizens who have retreated from traditional representational democracy into their private life. So, you know, it's been decades now that people have been writing about the collapse of all of the traditional metrics for political participation, party membership, political affiliation, turnout in elections. But I think also there is a sort of almost psychic shift when it comes to politics. My friend Ivan Krastev has written some brilliant books about the rise of the new protest movements, and he sees them not as a sort of resurgence of representative democracy, but as a crisis of representation, the negation of 1848 and the idea of the citizen voter. Because you have these people who are coming to the street who are interested not in being represented or participating in elections, but seeing politics as a kind of experience. All of the new technologies which allow people to connect, to organize, actually strangely seem to be making it more and more difficult to have the sort of collective will that you need to make positive things happen, and actually result more in what Francis Fukuyama called a sort of vetocracy. Anyway, so that's the sort of first thing, where the citizens are basically retreating into their private lives and into politics as experience rather than representational democracy. The second void is obviously, according to Mayer, is more about it's not about this demand for representational politics, it's more about the supply. And he says that parties have actually vacated a lot of the traditional functions that they had of expressing people's views or representing them, that political parties used to be embedded in civic life, but actually they've now become appendages of the state instead of being embedded in civic life. And he talks about a governing class that seeks office rather than political movements that actually want to represent ideas or groups in society. I think the third thing, something which struck me very strongly last year when I was on sabbatical in the United States of America, where I sort of spent quite a lot of time talking to the people around Obama and watching Obama function, and it became very, very clear that politics used to be about changing minds, but the revolution in political technology has meant that it's now something very, very different. It's much more about maximizing the turnout of people who already agree with you. That, obviously, there was always an element of that in traditional political campaigning, but the mining of big data and the kind of revolution in campaigning, which Obama embodied, has dramatically changed that and allowed it to happen on an industrial scale. And I think some of the intellectual roots for this kind of politics lie in the work of Obama's former colleague at the University of Chicago, Cass Sunstein, who actually worked in the White House for a long time until a year or two ago. And he wrote this famous book with Richard, I don't know if it's Thaler or Thaler or however you pronounce it, called Nudge, where they sort of argue that it's much easier to change people's behavior than it is to change their minds. So they say that the best way of changing people's behavior is to manipulate the so-called architecture of choice. So basically, I mean, they're sort of banal examples that they use, like if you want to get, get people to opt out rather than opt in to pensions, or if you want kids to eat fruit, don't tell them that fruit's a good thing, put the fruit in their line of sight when they're at the counter, and you hide the chocolate somewhere else, and they're more likely to go for the fruit, because the architecture of choice has been manipulated. But if you look at political campaigning nowadays, it's much more about framing questions in a way that would actually mobilize people who already agree with you and create a majority amongst those people than it is about actually engaging with the arguments of your opponents and trying to change people's minds. And I think if you take all of those different kind of things, what you see is a sort of political void which is being created by the mainstream parties and which the insurgent parties are now trying to fill. And they're recasting politics as a dispute between elites and the people. And they're rediscovering some of these forgotten roles, which the roles like those of opposition and expression, rather than just being part of the governing class. In fact, some of these insurgent parties go to extraordinary lengths to avoid having to govern. I know in Norway you're very cruel and you force these parties usually to become finance minister. But in other countries, they're less good at doing that, which means that the parties are actually able to benefit a lot from this kind of void that I'm talking about. And in many ways, the European elections are the perfect vehicle for these parties, because it's not an election that will result in a government. It's a kind of perfect act without consequence. So it is almost, if you were kind of looking at a scientific process to design the perfect election for insurgent parties, it would look very much like the European elections. So anyway, those are kind of three ways of trying to understand the different elements of Euroscepticism. I mean, three ways of understanding the phenomenon, which we can kind of go into. What does it actually mean? Well, that's not entirely clear yet. So before the elections, I wrote a number of pieces saying that we're going to see the emergence of a self-hating parliament, that most of the people, you might have a large number of people in the European Parliament who didn't actually believe in the existence of the EU, let alone the parliament that they were represented in. I didn't really think it was going to happen, but I thought it was worth just getting people to think about what was happening, because there are clearly profound shifts going on. Unfortunately, the Eurosceptics didn't actually do well enough for it to look like a self-hating parliament. So this is what actually happened in the European Parliament, difference between 2009 and 2014. And what you can see is the EPP, which is the main centre-right group, did lose a bit of support. The mainstream centre-left party stayed more or less where it was. The ALDE group, which is the kind of liberal group, the most kind of federalist and pro-system of the groups, lost a little bit of support. The Greens lost a little bit of support, and there was a little surge in the sort of Eurosceptic grouping, the ECR, which that's where the British Conservative Party, the Law and Justice Party in Poland sit. And then actually the reason this looks better than it is because the crazy right-wingers box didn't seem to appear. So anyway, should be another column here with the EFD group, which is where Nigel Farage and others, and then there are some independents. Okay. Anyway, if you look at it, you can see, as Pernilla said before, that up to about 30% of the people who got elected are from Eurosceptic parties, which puts them at about the same level as the EPP group and the S&D group, which are the sort of dominant groups. But they're not a very cohesive force within the parliament. And for that reason, so far the mainstream parties have been pretty good at keeping the show on the road, at excluding them from important positions within the parliament, and making sure that they're not dramatically changing the functionings of the parliament. Although, people who study the parliament much more closely than I do worry about the difficulties that the EU will have if it tries to have big steps forward in the governance of the Eurozone or ratifying trade deals like TTIP. You could see blocking majorities emerge on those sorts of, blocking minorities emerge on those sorts of issues. And it's clearly true that if the community method becomes more difficult, then pro-Europeans are likely to focus ever more on delivering the most sensitive types of integration through emergency powers, through intergovernmental treaties, rather than through methods which involve the European Parliament and the European Commission. And you'll see an acceleration of the trends which have taken place since when the crisis started anyway. In other words, kind of integration by stealth rather than through the political system, through the back door of the European Council. But I think the real danger is not so much that those kind of formal channels get blocked up. It's the way that this surge of insurgent parties rebounds on the national political systems and the agenda of the mainstream parties. And you've already seen quite a lot of hardening from the mainstream parties on the European issue, on migration. It's often very hard to distinguish between the positions of the British Conservative Party and UKIP on some of these questions. When Nicolas Sarkozy talks about about the crisis of the Schengen area and restricting Schengen, he doesn't sound that different from Marine Le Pen. So there is a sort of bleeding across into the mainstream parties. And in fact, that's their goal. When I interviewed Nigel Farage last year about what his goals were, he basically told me that he thought the most successful party in British political history was the SDP, which many of you probably haven't even heard of because it doesn't exist anymore. It's a party that was a breakaway from the Labour Party in the early 1980s, and by the 90s it had disappeared because it had merged with the Liberal Party and is now... but Nigel Farage says the party might not exist anymore, but it's actually infected all the other parties. So we don't have one SDP now, we have 3 SDPs. We've got the Labour Party, the Tory Party, and the Liberal Democrats. And he says, if I'm successful, it's not really because I have lots of seats in House of Commons, it's because I changed the way that the mainstream parties operate on the issues that I care about. Anyway, so so that's obviously, I think, the biggest danger. But I also think another danger is how the mainstream parties respond to these signals that we're seeing coming out of the political process. My biggest fear is that the response of the mainstream parties is going to be to retreat further into technocratic cooperation and to try and carry on with business as usual. Because this European Parliament shows that they can actually do it in the European Parliament, and they might do it in other places. But I think that just reinforces this cycle of technocracy and populism, which can only end in one way, which was the whole system blowing up eventually, because we will stretch things so far that there is no way out of it. So I think rather than trying to form a pro-European bloc, what the parties should do is actually try and create the space to have proper battles between competing visions of Europe, and try to preserve left-right competition at both a national and a European level, rather than becoming this kind of blue pro-integration blob that defends the status quo from the insurgents. And in order to do that, and this is something which, if there's time, I've got lots of ideas on, but you need to basically come up with this new narratives which can appeal to the different groups that I started out with. So you need to have an account about how we deal with migration, and an acknowledgement that though everyone benefits from migration in the aggregate, lots of people don't benefit from migration. It does create real pressures and real difficulties. And unless we're able to redistribute the benefits more widely so that we compensate the losers and we stop there being kind of major negative impacts on particular parts of the country, on particular sectors, on public services, that we might actually lose the consent for free movement of labour, which is, I think, one of the big advantages and big achievements historically of the European Union. Secondly, we need to have a new agenda for growth. How are we going to thrive in an era of China-led rather than US-led globalization? How are we going to make sure that we can actually write the rules for the global economy? How are we going to make sure that that our kids are going to have meaningful jobs, that they're going to be protected, that we're not going to see what Thomas Piketty describes, which is all the benefits of globalization accruing to a tiny fraction of the 1% rather than to the mainstream societies. And thirdly, we need to have an account about self-government, because I think, so where I started with the Cameron joke, I do think that the fact that the emasculation of our political systems, the fact that we don't feel that we can control anything, is one of the most pernicious features of what's going on. And I think we need to talk about what self-government means in the 21st century. It's different from the exercise of sovereignty in the 20th and 19th and 18th centuries. But Europe, if it's going to mean anything, has to be a platform which allows us to solve the problems of the 21st century, from big data to the rise of China. And anyway, in all of this, I think the challenge should be to drive wedges between the Eurosceptics rather than encouraging them to form an anti-elite bloc. And in order to do that, I think the mainstream centre-left and centre-right parties need to do much more to acknowledge the Eurosceptic critique of Europe, whilst rejecting the solutions that the Eurosceptics propose. And, you know, because whether they blame it for austerity or uncontrolled immigration, a lot of Europeans are really angry at the EU because it hasn't worked as they expected. It is going through real problems. These are kind of not illusory. And unless pro-Europeans look like they understand that and are coming up with solutions of it and they own the critique, they will get swept away by a massive wave of rejection. And I really believe that passionately, that I think the only way that you can actually defeat the Eurosceptics is to confront them on their turf, to accept that not everything is kind of good, to lay out a vision for the Europe that we want, rather than a defense of the Europe that we have, a Europe that isn't working and that is failing too many people. Many thanks. Sit down. Okay, great.
Switch this on. Thank you so much, Mark. I think this was a very good overview of the problem of Euroscepticism. I agree with almost everything you said, so that's not a good starter. First, you had a great joke. You started off with that. First, let me say that I think that the way you portrayed Euroscepticism today is you really brought something new into the discussion, not kind of only talking about these parties, but you're linking it to the essence on the political narratives and the political dynamics in the EU, and also the role of and the status of, let's say, representative democracy in Europe today. Since you had this fantastic joke, it struck me that maybe I should have a joke myself. And I'm told that during the McCarthy period in the US, there was a public hearing, and somebody said, I'm a communist. And no, there was a question, are you a communist? And he said, no, I'm an anti-communist. And then he said, I don't care what kind of communist you are. And that's the way I think it's a bit the problem with the label, Euroscepticism. Because we shouldn't confuse Euroscepticism with healthy political opposition. I think in democracy you need opposition, and that's one of the strengths of democracy. And I agree with you. The solution to the problem somehow that in a democracy you should interact, you should listen to the opposition, and then try to cultivate new solutions. So, and here I think the protagonist for your stronger European integration has a big responsibility to make sure that the European project has a broad popular support. And we should be cautious, actually, I think, about using this label, Eurosceptic. And as you are aware of, there are many different layers of that are grouped together as Eurosceptic. Some are what Taggart and Scherbeck call hard Eurosceptics, and some are soft, and the hard ones are principled against European integration, whereas the softer ones are not against European integration, but against European integration as it's unfolding today. Some are rejectionists outright, some are revisionists, some are minimalists, some are gradualists, some are reformists, and some are even maximalists, right? So the label, I don't like it that much. We should talk about more opposition, I think, in democracy. Now, just a footnote there. I think in the history of European integration, there have always been very few strong supporters. And there have also been fairly few opponents. Most of us have been rather indifferent. And what has happened is that the small fraction of supporters have become smaller, and the fraction of opponents a bit bigger. But I think the most significant thing is that the ones who used to be indifferent have become more critical. So, and that might swing back again, but I think you're pointing to something very important. Now, my second point relates to the causes of Euroscepticism, if you use that label. I think that during your presentation, you started out with the trust argument. And I think that you covered lots of issues on austerity, economic crisis. But towards the very end, you touched upon migration. I think migration is very important. And there are two sets of migration here. One of them is internal migration in the EU. And with the enlargement of the EU, you have increased dramatically the kind of migration flows. And the economic crisis has contributed to the migration issue. And then you have third country migration. And I think that in the political debate, we are not so good to separate between these different migration flows. And they have trigger different political responses. Some of them are xenophobic, some of them are welfare benefits, and we have to engage in a proper, much more systematic discussion on the dynamics of migration in Europe. I agree with you. You build your argument, Mark, on the decline of trust. I think if I'm correct, if you added to your slide a question on trust in national government, the picture might even look worse. Up until recently, at least, it did. Maybe this. So we're not only talking about, I think, a decline in trust towards European institutions, but we're talking about the decline in trust in national governments, national politicians, also a deep decline in trust in financial institutions, in markets, even in media. I think one of the few people still tend to trust is scientists, political scientists, experts, etc. But even that might vanish. So we are in a situation of radically decline in trust. So I think that does make the situation easier, but it's not only the EU, but it's a kind of complete collapse of trust in general. And I think one of the reasons why Europe is struggling is that we are experiencing a generational shift. Some of the political leaders and politicians, they didn't create the EU as we see it. They inherited it. They saw it as, it was not their solution to a set of problems. It was the previous generation's solutions to their problems. And the current generation of politicians, they have not been able to create a narrative presenting EU and European integration as a solution to their problems, I think. And this generational issue is not only for political leaders, but also for the voters. The younger voters, they don't recognize and are not aware of what would a no Europe be today. I think so. I think the generational aspect is an important topic. Now, I think one of the main challenges here is that this is a crisis that is pre-told. Somehow, everybody knew that somehow this had to happen. In 1994, Fritz Scharf wrote an excellent paper. He's written many papers and the same argument in lots of them, but basically said that there's a joint decision trap in the EU. And he argued that the 4 basic freedoms of movement within the internal market of goods, persons, services, and capital had resulted in a significant limitation of formal policy-making capacities of the member states, leaving the member states with less authority than 20 years ago for resolving economic and political problems. At the same time, the same politicians had not allocated policy-making capacities to the EU. And he argued they had not do it, and he basically argued also they would be unable to do it. So they couldn't strengthen the European level nearly as much as the decline of capabilities at the national level. So this was what he said, the joint decision trap in Europe. You allocated capabilities to institutions that didn't hold the capabilities, and you couldn't match up. And since the EU level was weak, he said, with unclear decision-making authority, inefficient negotiations, and too many diverse interests, it could not provide sufficient positive integration to compensate for the effects of kind of negative integration caused by the removal of barriers and introduction of the internal market. And he said at that time, mid-1990s, there was only 2 solutions to this problem. Either improving the policy-making capacities of the EU to avoid deadlocks and veto points, moving towards a really European state, or for the member states to basically win back some of their problem-solving capacity. And so I think that it's unavoidable to talk about Euroscepticism without addressing the competence allocation and the capabilities of making decisions. I think it's at the essence. And that's why I think I have lots of sympathy for David Cameron in his attempt of formulating an agenda to addressing the allocation of competences. But it's very unfortunate for him and for Europe that he is unable to present that discussion as a European discussion. He's presenting it as a British discussion. And this problem-solving capacity, I think, is fundamental. If you go back to the old Martin Lipset, argued that legitimacy is the capacity of a political system to foster and maintain the belief that its institutions are capable of resolving the major problems facing the society. And he said, for any new institution, you have to develop that kind of legitimacy. And even for institutions that hold the legitimacy, if you're unable to solve the problems, you will have a collapse of legitimacy. On the Cameron thing, you mentioned in the UK. Just a small thing there. And then I'll say a few words about Norway, and then I end. I think on the Cameron, it's lots of things to be said there. But Mark, what you said on the Singapore, some people in the UK are happy to become a Singapore. This is very interesting. For Norway, kind of a small state, we've always kind of been aware that we are completely unable to control our environment. It's a small state you cannot control. You have to develop some kind of adaptability. UK, in my eyes, and many of the largest states in Europe, in an area of globalization, are becoming small states. But they have to cope with this notion of what does it mean to be a small state. And one of the most important preferences of small states would be to introduce some kind of order. You would stimulate an order. And I think that it was very radical if the UK were to kind of see themselves as being like a Singapore. Smaller states would typically have preferences for having an order. And I think what kind of political debate about the future of Europe could we imagine if all European states, we treat them as small states? In political history of Germany, Italian city-states, etc. There's lots of metaphors we can use there, thinking about what kind of future architecture should we have if it's difficult to be a small state. Okay, and then on Norway, because you hinted at that as well. I think in Norway we have 3 main lessons that we can bring to the table on Eurosceptics from Norway. The first is the notion about pragmatic opposition. We have had 2 no to the EU referendums in Norway, but still we have a very close European integration. We are like 3/4 EU members. Societal developments in Norway is pretty similar to the ones in the EU. That kind of indicates that European integration is not only a choice by the EU, it's a deep societal, technological, functional transformation going on. And there's really no escape from that transformation. And there's a field of gravity somewhere in Europe, be it in Berlin or in Brussels. And the rest of us are circling around it. Norway is not an EU member, but they're circling, orbiting this at a slightly kind of bigger distance. So that's the argument that Europe opposition, it doesn't matter, that societal developments will be pretty much the same. So that's the first lesson. And then the other lesson is that we have had the Eurosceptics early on in Norway, on the left and on the right. But both shifting governments have been able to integrate them. And today, Norway is one of the countries without a far left or a far right hardcore Eurosceptic party. It's quite amazing. We don't have that. And the third lesson, and it's a bit of a challenge, we also have a very dramatic history just a few years ago when Berit Breivik blew up the government buildings and went out just 40 minutes drive from here and killed close to more than 70 political active youths. And if you read his political manifesto, he said this is Euroscepticism. He wanted to kill the political youth because they advocated and destroyed the nation state and stimulated European integration. And so that's my question to you, Mark, on what's the political violence dimension to this? So, okay, so, and then just to wrap up, what is this story today that you told, a very strong story, would leave us for into the future? On the one hand, you said that we could imagine that the European technocrats and politicians would be able to reform, but you came out to be very pessimistic on that. More likely that they will retract to some kind of technical, bureaucratic nonsense, more or less, and make the problem even bigger. The other solution is that basically the problem will go away by itself, because we get economic growth, migration might change, etc., and then we're back to square one. And the third possibility is that a crisis might very well happen, just happen, because of some kind of accident in 2017 in UK, or a French presidential election or something like that. So I would like to hear your views about, okay, given the inability to take into account the Eurosceptics, given the likelihood that this is going to be with us for quite some time, what would this mean? You said that it might fall apart. When will it fall apart if you don't kind of adjust to it? Thank you. Mark, we can come up here.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for a very, first to Mark, for a very interesting talk, and then to Ulf for interesting comments. Maybe you want to respond to some of Ulf's comments first, and then while you respond, I can take some questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, I mean, it was really very rich and interesting, and I agreed with a lot of what you said in terms of your analysis. So I think we're in a, as you said at the beginning, we do seem to, I think we agree on the kind of big picture. In terms of your specific questions about where this goes and what's going to happen, I mean, who knows really what's going to happen, but I do think that there is a temptation amongst a lot of the political mainstream to use the structural power that they have in the system to... Sorry, maybe take a step back. When the crisis first happened, people said, basically, we have a choice ahead. It's political union or disintegration. And lots of people bought into that analysis, particularly the kind of federalists in Brussels and the Eurosceptics. It turns out that we've had neither collapse nor political union, but a kind of messy, technocratic kind of muddling through, doing just enough to stop things from blowing up, but not enough to make people like what's going on anymore. So I think that is the most likely scenario in the future, that there isn't going to be any sort of clarity. There'll be tactical adjustments to what's going on. So there will be some attempts to hear the messages of, I mean, look at what happened after the European elections. The first thing that happened was there was a kind of there was a technocratic fight back. So they said, the people have spoken. Obviously, they wanted Jean-Claude Juncker. So naturally, we should hear the fact the voice of the people and enshrine this democratic moment and anyway. So that's one kind of thing. But the other response has been the sort of hardening of stances by a lot of mainstream parties on migration, which is the kind of which is sort of dealing with it more. Unfortunately, they're not really challenging the Eurosceptic narratives. They're sort of aping them rather than actually engaging with them in a kind of more useful way. The other, my kind of sense is that we are dealing with really big structural shifts. So you said, is it all going to be all right if growth returns? I don't think that's going to change anything, actually. The British attitude to migration is quite instructive in that regard. For the last few years, migration's been one of the top one or two political issues when you ask people unprompted what's the most important issues on your mind. Immediately after crisis, it was number 2 issue, and a lot of people thought when growth returned, it would fall down and people would focus on other stuff, the health service, etc. Actually, the opposite's happened. Now that we don't have to worry about the economy, we can be really worried about migration. So it's now the number 1 political issue rather than the number 2 political issue. I think it's because these are sort of quite big structural shifts. The crisis of representation, Europe is obviously not the cause of it, but it is the most obvious symptom of it, because you have a crisis of elites. The most elitist project around is the European Union, built by elites. Brussels is a long way away. It's a lot further away than any national capital. So it's kind of obvious that will be a focal point for anti-elitist sentiment. And so I really don't think those things are going to sort of totally disappear. But at the same time, people themselves are sort of conflicted. I mean, you talked about the situation here, and in a way, one of the reasons I think there are 2 reasons why you don't have a kind of hardcore Eurosceptic right-wing party. Well, maybe 3 reasons. One is the Eurosceptics. One, you're not in the European Union, though I know, as you've very convincingly shown, you're not really out of it either. But you're as far out of it as you can be whilst taking full advantage of most of the benefits that you get from being within the system, which is probably what most people want in Norway. Secondly, you have basically forced the parties into government, which has kind of delegitimated them and meant that they can't be real anti-system parties. And thirdly, having someone like Breivik as a sort of spokesperson for Euroscepticism obviously helps to put most people on the other side of the political equation. And in a way, we're seeing a bit of that in Britain. So there's this kind of strange Farage paradox. I mean, Farage hasn't killed anyone yet, and he's been very careful not to be a kind of far-right politician. But he does still scare people. So one of the paradoxes of the surge in support for UKIP is that it's also led to a surge in support for European Union membership. So support in Britain for being in the EU is at the highest level since 1991, which is really, quite remarkable. That on the one hand, the entire political agenda is being driven by UKIP, a party that barely existed a few years ago, whose central premise is withdrawing from the European Union, not having a referendum, but just getting out. And at the same time, that message is less popular than it's been from the beginning. And the only explanation is that whilst people like moaning about Brussels, they don't actually want to do anything about it. So if they think that there might be a party coming to power that could actually make that real, it sort of scares them back into the sort of mainstream.
Okay, I think we have a lot of questions, so we start with the question. We take 3 questions, and then you can respond. First, over there.
Thank you.
Please present yourself.
Yes, I'm Torgeir Fjertoft. Thank you. I hope my voice would carry in this small room, but to make sure that you all hear me. I'm Torgeir Fjertoft. I actually have a very fascinating dual role. I'm both a diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'm also currently a researcher or a visiting research fellow at the University of Oslo. And I think that your approach was very interesting because you said that you talk to people to sort of get their story. What is their narrative? And I think this is what we all should do. And if I may share with you, I think that what I'm now going to say derives from 3 different experiences. My first experience is dealing with the EU internal market for 5 years, post the referendum in '94, free movement of goods. So I happen to know that the EU has practically changed Norwegian everyday life, and for the better, without anybody noticing, which was probably good. And my second experience is from a pub in Edinburgh, and my third experience is from a cafe in Greece. And I think that these 3 experiences, they tell me that Euroscepticism or skepticism towards the EU has actually nothing to do with the EU. It has to do with something else. And I think that people react very appropriately to policies that have failed to deliver. And these policies are national policies. And I'm not going to delve into the Norwegian scene because I think it's too parochial. I think Norway can do without us, so we're not a big problem. But when I was in Edinburgh, in the pub, people say roughly the same thing about London as you mentioned, the British said about the EU, which was basically that politicians were corrupt and idiots, basically. And why did they say that? Because they felt that they did not deliver policies that address people's concerns. And what are people's concerns? In Britain is obvious, because, when you look at the reforms from Thatcher and onwards, the narrative was that you had to basically cut down on services, pull back government responsibility for the private sector to deliver in a better way. And people's perception is that this has not happened. Instead, what you see is that differences between people increase. You have a financial sector totally out of control. And the people with less money pay the most taxes. That's the perception. And I think there's a lot to that. For example, if you read Piketty's book on capital, that's his basic message. And in Greece, it was basically the same thing. Poor us. We don't get money from the EU. And I told them, well, you should have all these rich Greeks pay taxes. That's what we do, The reason why we don't have a problem is because we have people pay taxes. And the Greeks said, but you can't make rich people pay taxes. Everybody knows that. It's impossible. And if you look at the statistics, the harder hit the public sector is in the EU member states, the higher is the private wealth. So it's obviously a failure of national politics to address national problems. And basically, it's the ideology of liberalism and free market that emanated in the 1980s in response to the post-war regulated economy that has now failed to deliver. Thank you.
Okay, we take the next question, Mark.
Thank you very much. Mark Leonard here at NUPI. The subject of China. For China, European relations have been very important for Chinese foreign policy, at least as far back as the Deng Xiaoping era. But about 10 years ago, there was a bit of a heyday of relations between China and the European Union. They both recognized each other as very important economic actors. But now you have China taking a much different approach to Europe as a result of the crisis. You now have a much greater focus on bilateral relations. Certain countries, Germany, Denmark spring to mind, have been great beneficiaries of this. So I guess my question would be, how do you see the China factor playing into the whole idea of Euroscepticism, especially now that we're seeing free trade agreements with non-European Union states such as Iceland and Switzerland? Thank you.
Okay, we think one more over here.
Thank you. My name is Inge Tygesen. I work for the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Department. Just returned from many, many years working for the Norwegian government in Brussels. I have a few comments. Ulf actually took a few of my points, in the sense that the one important thing I felt was lacking in your analysis was the national factor. I think the vote for Le Pen in the European election in France was firstly and foremostly an anti-Hollande, anti-Sarkozy vote, as much as it was against Brussels. And I think in that sense, in the analysis of Euroscepticism, I think there is a tendency of overestimating the importance of Brussels and underestimating the general distrust you have of national politics. The second comment was, in a way, I found the slide you showed on the general increase in distrust in European Union that has increased both among the creditor countries in the north and among the recipient countries in the south is also a very good illustration of a very European thing, the compromise, in the sense that in order to get through the crisis, you have in a way enough transfer from the north to the south to avoid collapse, but not enough to avoid the social consequences of the crisis. And this, of course, and I mean, it's just enough for the one that creditors that give away, that found that they give too much, and not enough for the recipients to feel that they have received what they need. And that, in a way, shows it's a very typical way of how decision making is done in Brussels in general. And my third comment is in a bit on how the system in Brussels is working. And you said, I agree with you, that one of the main things that you could do in a way to counter the Euroscepticism within the system in Brussels is to make a clearer distinction between not that you are either pro-European or against European cooperation, but that you show different visions between the mainstream parties. I find that following this quite closely in Brussels, the way the European institutions are constructed works counter that. Because, for instance, European Parliament, their main focus is the institutional battle between the Council and the Commission. And in order to have a strong vote in that battle, they need to be unified. So what you end up seeing is that in 80 to 90% of the cases, you have a grand coalition between EPP, S&D, and probably now you also have the Greens and the Liberals on board. So then it becomes establishment, anti-establishment, not right-wing, left-wing. And I think that feeds the anti-establishment to a huge extent. And my last comment would be, I think one element here, that's my analysis of it, is that I think it has probably been a too ambitious goal by those that created, say, the Constitutional Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty in the way that you transfer many competences, more competences to European level and to European Parliament as such, that one thing that has been underestimated is the fact that still the majority of policy making and what is matter to the people's lives are still being dealt with in national parliaments. And I think there is a lack of attention to the way that national parliaments need to be made responsible and also a participant in the creation of European policy. For instance, by controlling the participants in the council, their governments, and making the governments respond to the national parliaments in how they behave and how they carve out politics. Especially after the financial crisis, the real core of the decision-making being done by the European Union is not done in the European Parliament, but is done within the Council and within the competence of the Council alone. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have so much time left, but I think we will continue a little bit over time since we started a bit late, if that's okay with you. You can start answering, and then we take 3 more questions after that.
Okay. I mean, I think I basically said all the things that you said. So I agree with you. It's about national politics, it's not about European politics. Here it's a symptom rather than the cause. I think I said the same thing about compromise and about the self-defeating way that the mainstream parties are hanging together. So yeah, yes. On China, I mean, I don't think it's a big factor in terms of Euroscepticism. You know, I think it features a little in the sense that there is a sort of narrative that, particularly in Britain, that we can be a sort of global trading nation and develop our own links with other countries. Though, obviously, it's if you actually start, you know, if there was an honest, evidence-led discussion about these things, it would be kind of obvious that we'd be better off and more likely to defend our interests with China if we had a market with 500 million people behind it, which was the biggest market in the world, rather than trying to do these things on a bilateral basis. I think those are the questions for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ulf, do you want to?
No, I just think that we can collect.
Okay, then Bjørnar next.
Thank you. My name is Bjørnar Sverdrup Tygeson. I'm here at NUPI. First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture. And what I would like to inquire a bit about, as I mean, you were talking about these big structural shifts that we see today, and one of the biggest one of these is, of course, that the European share of political and economic power is in rapid decline in this Asian century. And as far as I've been able to pick up, the answer to this challenge has been more Europe, that Europe needs to talk with one voice and get out there as a more unified actor. And also I think the ECFR has done an admirable job of creating a sort of narrative of a common European foreign policy. So my questions is basically, firstly, what do you think is the long-term effect of the rise of Euroscepticism on this strategy of more Europe as a way to handle with this big strategic shift internationally? And secondly, does the Eurosceptics have an alternative strategy to more Europe when dealing with these fundamental global power shifts? Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have one question over here.
Hi there, my name's John Todd. My question is about sort of the generational shift, and then from, if you like, the previous generation having this very strong shared fear of going back to the first half of the 21st century, and that's disappeared, if you like, a little bit with this new generation. And that to prevent this sort of spiraling technocratic versus populist thing, that we need some kind of new shared idea on what that might be. Thanks.
Okay, then over there.
Hi, my name is Michael Brunbo. I am a political commentator for a newspaper called Nationen, which perhaps means that I am the Eurosceptic in the room. But please don't hold that against me. I just have a question that I think might be a short version of the question you posed. You say that, because I mean the theme of this speech is, or was, addressing the problem of Euroscepticism. And as I understand, the answer is changing the narrative, introducing new narratives about Europe and about how the system might work. Can you change the narrative without changing the system? And if you have to change the system, how can you do that? What would the changes be? And who should enact those changes?
Thank you. And then the last question in the back.
Hi, my name's John Moody and I'm from the Arena Centre of EU Studies in Norway. There seems to be a political transformation going on in the UK, but it seems to be one full of contradictions. On the one hand, you've got the growth of Eurosceptic parties like the UKIP, but then on the other hand, there's been a poll that came out recently that says that support for remaining in the EU is there's a majority in favour of that. And also, when it comes to people's electoral interests, you've got kind of immigration right up there, but then the issue of Europe is way down on the list. So the public don't seem to be making the link between the immigration debate in the EU. So Europe's Euroscepticism doesn't seem to be explaining these kind of contradictions. So what do you think is? Secondly, you said that you fear that the political elite are going to try and go down kind of technocratic solutions, but then at the start of your discussion, you said that there's a democratic surplus in the EU, and I think you're right on that second point. But this comes down to the kind of the strength of the Eurosceptic debate that created this image of the EU as a very technocratic body. But the pro-European elite have got to try and bust this myth, because it is a myth. But the complexity of the EU system is it's very difficult for the pro-European elite to come up with a kind of simplistic argument for Europe. Is there a simplistic argument for Europe? Can that be put forward? And also, what is our role as academics in this debate? Should we be involved in kind of busting this Eurosceptic myth as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have 4 questions and about 5 minutes left.
Maybe going backwards, because on your 2 points, I mean, on the myth busting and the democratic surplus, I don't think that myth busting is a particularly useful or constructive or kind of successful approach to things. It's not very good to tell people they're kind of stupid and that they don't understand things. I think the solution should be about telling people a story about where they want to go, which is kind of convincing and getting them to want to see that you're engaging with their concerns and their experiences and offering them some kind of hope of a better future. On the democratic surplus thing, I don't think it's I don't think the democratic deficit is a myth. Actually, I think it's very real in some countries, like in Greece at the moment. I think it was overstated in the 90s when people started sort of writing endless articles about it, and the European Parliament used it as the main reason for its own accretion of power. But I think the problem is more that it's misdirected democratic surplus. So you give people lots of say over things that they care very little about, and no real control over the big issues which affect them a lot, like the Maastricht convergence criteria, for example, was something which was very big and has huge effects on what your national politics can do, and there was no way of affecting that. On your thing about the British confusing polling, etc., I don't think it's very confusing. I mean, basically, people don't care about Europe. That's been very clear forever. But they do care about other issues. So they'll care about Europe insofar as it's linked in with other issues. They care a lot about migration. One of the geniuses of UKIP and other parties is to fuse those two issues. But Europe is something which is a bit sort of abstract, unless it's linked in with things that people do care about. I think I already explained the link between UKIP's surge and the surge in support for EU membership. On your question, I don't think I hope I didn't say that Euroscepticism was a problem and that the solution was new narratives. What I was trying to describe is profound changes to our politics, which are going on. I think of which Euroscepticism is a kind of feature and a symptom, but it's not. I don't see it as a sort of core problem. I think it's just a kind of expression of quite big changes which are going on, and they're not changes which can be solved by a few narratives or anything. I don't think the crisis of representative politics is quite a big story, and I don't know where it's going to end up. But you can think about some kind of tactical things you should avoid doing, which is one of the things I talked about doing. But what were the other questions?
China.
China.
A global power shift, China.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I don't think we're kind of heading towards an Asian century, by the way, or that there's a rapid decline of the EU. The EU is growing very slowly. Other parts of the world, their economies are growing faster, etc. I think what is profound is that there is both a shift in resources in the sense that other parts of the world are catching up with our levels of material prosperity, and that's combined with a global political awakening, which means people don't really buy into the legitimacy of the order that we've built based on our kind of power, and therefore they neither want us in particular to be running the world, nor to accept the norms that we have said were universal, but which always looked like they were quite self-serving. So that's what's going on, and yeah, in that sense, I think it makes sense for us to try and come together as far as possible and to protect our advantages as long as we can. Who wouldn't want to make it last as long as you could? But I think, as you say, that's more difficult when you're having a sort of profound crisis of interdependence, which makes any political action very difficult, whether it's at a local, national, international, or European level. It's more difficult at a European level than it is at some of the lower levels, just because the forces of the kind of centrifugal forces are more powerful there. Was that?
Can I also respond slightly to the Brøndmo's question? Because I don't think you're the only Eurosceptic in the room, as you said. Because one of the things that is that there you have to separate between people who might supported towards some kind of European integration or cooperation, but not supportive to this kind of specific policy within the EU. So that's the first point. The other thing, I didn't read Mark either as saying that the spin, kind of the narrative element that you said is not a kind of, should not be confused with a political spin. I think it kind of was, maybe I understood you as re-advocating a kind of different take on democracy, that are more seriously going to reconnect somehow what's going on, really going on, try to understand that. And then for me, from my position at least, I would say in such a process, it would be natural to reflect upon the allocation of competences in the EU, the policies that are doing, and also the politics, the processes through which these policies are shaped. And my third point, and I think that's something that should be, that's really important, is that if we don't do this, we might very well end up in a situation out of kind of almost chance, some kind of random event that could leave us into a position where actually none of us would like to be it the Eurosceptics or others, right? So there's an element of chance created by this, because you have lots of different decision opportunities created through elections. And I think that creates some kind of really dangerous uncertainties.
Thank you so much. I think we need to stop here. Thank you for a very interesting introduction, and for interesting comments, and for all of you for coming and for posing interesting questions. So thanks a lot. Thank you.